My name is Jackie Sullivan, and I'm an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at Western. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second in our series of talks on philosophical perspectives on happiness and well-being that are sponsored by the Rotman Institute of Philosophy at Western as part of our annual lecture series here at the London Library. And I wanted to bring your attention to the fact that there'll be two more talks offered in the series in the next 2 weeks. Rachel Margolis from Western Sociology Department will be giving a lecture on the issue of well-being, the well-being of older adults without close kin on January 31st. And Eric Agner from the University of Stockholm will be giving the last talk in the series on the issue of the relationship between philosophy and the science of happiness on February 7th. Eric will also be giving a second talk at Western that will be on the topic of why the science of well-being needs the philosophy of well-being and vice versa, and that will be on February 8th at 2 p.m. And you can find details about all of these talks on the Rotman website. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Anthony Skelton, who is an associate professor of philosophy in the Department of Philosophy at Western. Dr. Skelton received his PhD from the University of Toronto in 2005 and did a postdoc at the University of Michigan before Gosh, it's a big difference between those two places. Sorry, before coming to Western. His research is historically focused on issues in moral philosophy and practical ethics, and in recent years, having spent time as an invited visiting fellow at the Uehiro Center for Practical Ethics at Oxford University and the Foundation Brochet in Switzerland, he has turned his attention to thinking about the ethical implications of the development of medical research and biotechnologies. Dr. Skelton has published numerous articles on issues such as children's welfare and well-being, utilitarianism, and bioethics. He's currently working on a book under contract with Cambridge University Press on Henry Sidgwick's ethics, and his book, Anthony's book, Bioethics in Canada, the second edition of which will be released this year, is the #2 selling book in Canada. So that's a pretty
in that area.
He's also an excellent teacher, having received numerous awards for his teaching at Western, and he's also a really great colleague to have. So I hope you're looking as much forward to his talk as I am. Without further ado, I give you Anthony Skelton, who will be talking to us about thriving children.
Great. Thanks so much, Jackie. That's very kind of you. I appreciate that very much. Some of it is true. Okay, so as my colleague Jackie said, I'm an associate professor here at Western in philosophy and also a member of the Rotman Institute of Philosophy. And my talk is called Thriving Children. I started thinking about the issue of the nature of children's welfare about 10 years ago when I had a conversation with my colleague Samantha Brennan. Some of you may have come to her talk last week. And I wanted to investigate this a little bit, and I went out into the philosophical world, and I found that actually there was very little that had been published on this topic. That was surprising because in lots of other areas of the academic world, like sociology and of course psychology, there's lots of research on children and also on children's well-being and happiness. So one of the great things about philosophy is you start asking questions, and if you're employed to do it for a living, you can try to answer those questions. And so one of the things I want to do was answer the question of what children's well-being consists in and try to plug a little gap in our knowledge. Okay. So my focus is the nature of children's well-being, what makes a child's life go well, what is good for a child. Those are the sort of two kind of questions on which my research has been focused. These are pictures of my two children. They're my most important and closest research subjects. So you'll see a few pictures of those. Please be tolerant of them. Okay. So of course it's possible, as I said a moment ago, to study children's well-being from a variety of different perspectives. As I said, there's lots of parts of the academic world that focus on it. Perhaps the two most prominent perspectives are the psychological perspective and then also the philosophical perspective. And so one of the things that we're going to hear in a couple of weeks from Eric Agner, who's a philosopher at Stockholm, is the relationship between people who study the psychological aspects of well-being or the science of well-being and people who study the philosophical aspects of well-being, and what those two studies can tell each other, how they can be mutually informing. I'm also interested in that, but on the topic today, I'm just going to talk about the philosophical perspective. So typically a philosophical study of children's well-being will tell us something about what we broadly call in philosophy the causes of or what correlates with well-being or happiness. Psychologists like to focus on this thing called life satisfaction. They typically equate that with either happiness or well-being. So for example, a recent article in the New York Times said, oh, happy children, they do chores. And it's a study about how children who are incorporated into the home and pressed into the service of doing chores tend to experience certain kind of happiness in doing that, tend to report, at least as they grow older, higher levels of happiness than children who don't involve themselves in those chores or aren't asked to do chores in the home. So that'll tell you something about what causes happiness or what causes well-being. It's a descriptive science, so it's telling you a description or giving us a description of what are the things out there in the world that might be used as instruments or might be things that are correlated with or concomitant with a view about well-being or happiness, whether that's children's happiness or anyone's happiness. There's lots of studies, obviously, that don't talk about children, that talk about other people's happiness, but this is my focus. But whatever the case may be, when psychologists or people in psychology are talking about causes or correlates or the things that are instrumental or are used as instruments for well-being, children's well-being or anyone's well-being, what they're going to presuppose, at least implicitly in some way, is some account of well-being's nature, what well-being consists in, right? Because of course, you can't really give an account of what the causes are of something without knowing what that something is, right? You can't tell me what the correlates are with something unless you tell me what that something is. So even though psychologists are going to be mostly talking about these instruments or these correlates or these causes, they're going to at least be working implicitly or latently with sometimes explicitly. Lots of psychologists have explicit views about well-being. They're going to be using at least implicitly some account of what well-being consists in. Okay, so then that turns us over to a different kind of study when we're thinking about what its nature is. Okay, so I guess I'm putting my cards on the table. I'll tell you a little bit about this in a minute. So well-being's nature probably isn't something, maybe we'll be convinced in 2 weeks that this is not the case, but probably isn't something that's determined at least exclusively by a psychological or empirical investigation, right? So you couldn't really tell us what the nature is by just looking at causes or correlates or doing quantitative measurement, right? Really only a philosophical investigation. Philosophers have, of course, talked about the nature of well-being and happiness for thousands of years, right? Only really a philosophical investigation can give us insight into well-being's nature, right? So this will tell you what it is for someone's life or for some part of someone's life to go well for them. So put it into my context, it will tell you what it is for a child's life to be going well for him or her. What is it for something to make a child better off? That's what an account of the nature of well-being will tell you. Okay, and part of what that involves, and here's where the philosopher might, I'm giving a brief now for my discipline, might have something to contribute, might have a unique expertise, as it were. Hope that's true, right? That can tell you something about the nature of well-being. It's a matter of looking at some of our common sense views or common sense attitudes about the issue of what it is for a child's life to go well or what it is for something to be good for a child, collecting those into some kind of coherent package or picture, and then developing a view on the basis of that. So it's a matter of getting an account of the nature of well-being that matches or fits best with some of our attitudes about what well-being consists in. Now, of course, those might be reflected in psychological studies, right? It would be unsurprising if, for example, having a loving family didn't have some part of your well-being, for example. And philosophers call these intuitions. We have intuitions about what it is for anyone's life to go well, but presumably we also have intuitions about what it is for an individual child's life to go, or for children's lives to go well. So the philosopher is going to look at those intuitions, and he or she is going to try to, from those intuitions, develop some kind of view about the nature of children's well-being. So that makes me something called an armchair philosopher, right? It's pretty good, it can pay well, and if you've got the right armchair, it can be kind of comfortable. Okay, so these are my cards on the table, right? So I'm the kind of person, I get a comfy chair, right? Other people are like this too. You sit down, you reflect soberly and rationally on what you think are the most important aspects of well-being, children's well-being in particular. You talk with your other informed colleagues and other people, and then from that you develop a position about it, which then you can either put into some general theory, right, about what you think are ways to equalize well-being, for example, or ways to promote well-being, or ways to retard effects on people's well-being, and so on. Okay, so the philosopher's job, just to summarize, is to try to arrive at an account of children's well-being that best fits with our common sense attitudes about it. Okay, and so what we're going to be doing is giving you an account of a shared, or giving a conception of a shared concept we have. So we all use the concept, whether we think we do or not, of well-being. We say some people are faring well, whether it's in their job, or in their marriage, or in their personal life. A child is faring well in school, in her relationships, in her sporting activities, and so on. We have a notion of well-being that applies broadly. It can apply to children, it can apply to people like you and I, it can apply to animals, it can apply to a broad range of what we might call welfare subjects. We all think there are certain things whose lives can go better for them, right, or can go worse for them. Things whose life can get very good at certain points, get very bad at other points. We can chart ups and downs and so on. Right? And this notion of well-being is what you're filling out when you're collecting these common sense attitudes about it and trying to fill out an account of its nature or give a conception of it. And it's equivalent roughly to what is good for an individual or beneficial or in their best interest. So when we talk about what's in the best interest of a child, or what's good for a child, or what is beneficial for her, that's really what we're talking about. We're talking about well-being. We're talking about what philosophers really call something called prudential value. It's a special kind of value. It's a value that philosophers are focused on. That's the value that I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about insofar as it pertains to the issue of children. Okay, is everybody on side with my setup? Yep. Okay, good. I usually teach a very large, greater than 200 person class, though probably only 100 ever show up. So this is kind of a nice, intimate group. Okay. Now, before I carry on, I just want to make an important distinction for the uninitiated, right? So people talk about happiness and well-being, or happiness and welfare, and it's important to make sure that we don't confuse these notions. So there seem to be, or at least some philosophers have made this distinction between two kinds of happiness. So anybody here read Aristotle? Right, the Nicomachean Ethics, right? So he talks about happiness, right? He talks about this idea of happiness, eudaimonia, right? And lots of people talk about happiness. Sometimes they're talking about what we now call welfare, what's good for you or what's beneficial for you, what's in your best interest. So we have to make sure that when we interpret people as talking about happiness, we are clear on what they mean. So there's what we call evaluative happiness. That's the notion that you use to evaluate someone's life. That's really equivalent to well-being. So when people talk about well-being, they're talking about evaluative happiness. So sometimes when people talk about happiness out there in the world, they're talking about evaluative happiness. Really, they're talking about well-being. Sometimes people, when they talk about happiness, are talking about a psychological state, right? How many people here like Prosecco? I do. Okay, it's a great sparkling wine, right? You drink it and it feels good, right? Sometimes you would say, that makes me happy. And what you're saying is, I'm in a psychological state, which I'm describing as happy. It's different from well-being. It may be part of well-being, as I'll say in a moment, something about that. But it's important that sometimes when you use the word happy, you mean I'm in a state that feels a certain kind of way, right? It has a phenomenology. And sometimes when you're talking about happiness, you're talking about really about well-being when you say, I had a happy life, or I'm very happy in my job, or I'm happy that I have great colleagues like Jackie, for example. Okay. All right. So, as I said, evaluative happiness is really equivalent to well-being. Okay, so these two things are roughly equivalent. So, as I said, sometimes when people talk about happiness, like Aristotle does, he's really talking about well-being. Okay, so now I'll fix my question a bit more clearly. So, a conception then, an account of that concept of well-being I mentioned a moment ago, or evaluative happiness, really will tell us, and these are the important philosophical bits, what is directly and non-instrumentally good for a child. So so when you say what's the nature of it, you're telling me what is it for something to have to be to contribute to something's, that is a child's well-being. What does it have to affect or cause to be good for a child? So what is directly non-instrumentally good? What is it that makes someone prudentially better off, makes them fare well, for its own sake, right? So that's non-instrumentally or directly, right? And as I said a moment ago, psychological happiness just tells us what's the sort of state you have to be in to be experiencing happiness. Okay, all right. All right, so here's my main questions then. So what is non-instrumentally good for a child, right? What are the sort of things, the possession of which would be directly good for a child, right? What directly contributes to a child's life going well? Those are not exactly the same question. One is kind of about what's happening at a moment. That's maybe the first question. And the other is what's happening to their life as a whole. And there's complicated, difficult questions in philosophical studies of well-being about how those two questions relate to each other. I won't touch on that today because I'm not sure exactly what I think. Just wanted to say that there are two questions. They're about non-instrumentality and directness. They're distinct, but they're also related. Okay, so that, I think, completes my setup. Okay. Wow. Now I want to say something important. So it used to be thought that, look, if you developed a conception or a theory of well-being for anything, but in my case for children, you would also be defending, or at least latently or implicitly developing a theory of ill-being, right? That's not necessarily the case. So it might be the case that if you develop a theory of well-being, you haven't said all of what's important to faring well, because you also have to give an account of a theory of ill-being, and they might not be symmetrical. It may be that well-being is one thing and ill-being is another. I picked this picture partly because that's my youngest son's first visit to Santa Claus, and he's not exactly faring well. There's a little bit of ill-being. And his brother there is, of course, smiling, and he's experiencing what I can only describe as an early form of what the Germans call Schadenfreude, which is pleasure in someone else's misfortune. Maybe we can say a little bit at the end about whether or not that particular kind of pleasure is directly and non-instrumentally good for a child. Okay. Some people disagree with that. I'm not so sure. Okay. My point was just that there may be some work to do, even once you've developed a theory of well-being, to then turn to develop a theory of ill-being. And one interesting thing, so not only have philosophers not said a whole heck of a lot about children's well-being, they have said, surprisingly, philosophers are not exactly a very happy bunch, but they've said surprisingly very little about the nature of ill-being. Some philosophers now are doing it, but it's a very rich, fertile area for it. Psychologists, of course, for a long time really only focused on ill-being. They've become a bit more positive in recent times. There's a kind of positive psychology movement. Okay, so where do you begin to develop a theory of well-being for children? Well, so as I said before, when I started thinking about this sort of 10 years ago after I had that conversation with my colleague, I started investigating some of the historical sources for well-being. I had previously been at the University of Toronto, as Jackie said, where I studied under someone who wrote a very important book on well-being. I started pouring through all the sources, and I didn't find very much, but I did find some very interesting things. So this is a quotation from Aristotle. This is from his book called The Nicomachean Ethics, where he works out a theory of happiness, or eudaimonia, and he says the following interesting thing. It is natural, then, that we call neither ox nor horse, nor any other of the animals happy, by which he means evaluative the happy, faring well. Okay? For none of them, this is the explanation, is capable of sharing in virtuous activity. For this reason also, a boy course, Aristotle's not thinking about girls because women for him were a less important figure compared to men. For he is not yet capable of such acts, those virtuous acts, owing to his age, right? He's immature. And boys who are called happy, sometimes, of course, he's got to admit, we do call children, especially boys, happy in his time, are being congratulated by reason of the hopes we have for them. So basically, Aristotle's idea is, look, I have a view of well-being, right? Well-being essentially involves activity in accordance with certain kinds of intellectual and also moral virtues. So courage is the paradigmatic moral virtue, and something like wisdom or good instrumental reasoning is a paradigmatic intellectual virtue. And the idea is that's what it is to be happy, to fare well, is to have activity or live in accordance with those virtues. Children and animals can't do that, so the implication is they can't fare well. They can't really be happy. And when we do call them happy, we're just saying, wow, we see there in the future, when the boy matures, when he reaches the age of reason, or whatever the case may be, when he's capable of those virtuous acts, we're saying we have high hopes that he'll get there and he'll flourish. Okay, so one of the things people like to do in philosophy is find a really great quotation from a famous philosopher that's outrageous and then criticize it. So that's what I'm going to do. So what's Aristotle's mistake? Well, he makes a whole pile of different mistakes, I think. But one of the mistakes he makes is that he reasons that there's really just one account. There's really just one view about the nature of well-being, the nature of what he called eudaimonia. That's the Greek word for happiness, okay? And it's just that life, activity in accordance with intellectual and moral virtues. And he assumes if you can't attain that, if you can't participate in that, you don't have a well-being, you can't fare well, okay? So the idea is there's only one way to fare well, or there's only one conception of well-being that would fit all welfare subjects. And if you don't fit it, you're not a welfare subject. Okay. So this actually is an assumption that's kind of widely shared. It may not have the implications that Aristotle's view had, that animals and children don't fare well, but there's an assumption, and this was an assumption that my supervisor at Toronto, as I mentioned a moment ago, who wrote this very important book called Welfare, Happiness, and Ethics. He's called Wayne Sumner, also assumed this idea of generalism, that there's really only one account of the nature of well-being, right? There's just one appropriate analysis of it. And so one of the attempts at innovation I made, I'm not sure it's a very good attempt, was actually to think that the mistake that Aristotle is making here and that other people are making is in assuming this generalism, that there's really only one conception of well-being. And my thought was that there might be more than one conception of well-being for different welfare subjects. In particular, my thought was that it might be true, right, that well-being for people like you and I consists in what Aristotle says it consists in, activity in accordance with certain kinds of virtues, right? So being courageous is one thing, being an effective reasoner or wise is another. For Aristotle, wisdom is about taking the appropriate steps to meet your ends or goals, right? It might be true that that's what well-being for us consists in, right? But it might be untrue that that's what well-being consists in for other welfare subjects, like smaller young children. So that it doesn't follow from the fact that children can't participate in this virtuous activity that they don't, as a consequence, fare well. Okay. So that was the first kind of innovation, first kind of thought I had, and that set me off onto an uncertain journey. Many people think that's the wrong way to go, but I'm going to be stubborn and persist and try to show you maybe there's something to this idea. Okay, so then I started looking around at other historical sources for people who'd given thoughts about happiness and well-being and things like this. And one of the important sources, he didn't really say this himself. It's hard to know exactly what he said because his works are very confusing. This is the Scottish philosopher David Hume. He's an 18th century philosopher, and he has this very interesting claim. He says, reason is and ought to be the slave of the passions and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. Roughly, his idea is We all are beings with desires. We all are beings that want certain kind of things, right? We're passionate about kind of things, certain kind of things, whole variety of different desires we have. And the job, the role, the function of reason is to try to figure out what are the most efficient means to getting to our ends, right? So reason doesn't tell you what things to like or desire. Reason just tells you how to get those things once you desire them. The important thing for my purposes is to take away from this that we might think, following Hume and many, many other people, that really what's good for you, what your well-being consists in, right, is the satisfaction of your desires, right? Everybody experiences having a desire for something, whether it's success in your career or it's more money or more clothing, bigger homes, etc., right? Sometimes when you get those things, you might think, or maybe every time you get those things, you might think that's what makes you better off, that's what improves your well-being. And of course, economists work almost exclusively with the idea of desires or preferences. They all think when they talk about well-being measurement and things of this nature, that well-being consists in the satisfaction of your preferences. So we might draw from this, right? This is a view that actually fits all welfare subjects, so isn't susceptible so much to the worry we have with Aristotle's view. And we might think, maybe it's true that children's well-being, what it consists in, like maybe adults' well-being or other animals' well-being, consists in the satisfaction of their preferences, what they want, right? Children from very young ages have wants, they have desires, they have preferences. You might think, look, each and every time their desires are satisfied, or each and every time their desires are frustrated, their life goes better for them in the first case and worse for them in the other case, right? This would be an interesting a view that would capture most or maybe all welfare subjects and could explain how, right, when a child gets food, right, when it gets warmth, when it has certain kinds of interactions, right, it's maybe getting what it's want, maybe we think that's what makes those things such that they make a child better off. Okay, so maybe not is my view, and I have two concerns. So that's my son eating my head. That's obviously where my hair went, right, when he was very small. Obviously he wanted to do that, right? Foolishly, I let him do that. You might think, look, this is maybe not the right view because, children, like many others, have odd or peculiar desires. So we think that even if they satisfy them, it's not clear that it makes them better off. Now, of course, this is a general worry we might have about the preference or desire view, right? That would be the case with even adults. We all have peculiar desire views. The remedy that philosophers have for this is in some way to launder the desires or expose them to information and the facts, but it isn't clear that that's the way to remedy the sort of strange or odd desires that children might have. So it's not like I would say to my son, look, I'm going to sit you down, I'm going to expose you to some facts and some information, and I'm pretty sure that once you get that, the desires you have will be the ones that are sort of truly authentically yours, right? I don't think that's the kind of thing that we would think would be the right thing to do, and it's not clear that that would be reflective of what would be good for them. The other thing is, the pool of children's desires is not very deep, and it's not very broad. So even if you thought, well, they might have some odd desires, but if we take the whole pool of their desires, maybe we could get some kind of relatively reasonable view about what would be good for them. But I think one worry with that is that, as I said, children's desires are not that deep, right? It's not clear that they cover all the things that we commonsensically think are good for them. So like, look, a child might have a pretty good pool of desires. I don't think it would be the case that if they didn't want to go to school, that would be a desire such that if it were satisfied, it would be good for them, or something like this. And it's not very broad. One of the reasons why we think it's possible to kind of launder desires like the ones that we have is partly a function of the fact that we have a pretty deep and broad preference or desire set. Okay, so maybe we don't agree with Aristotle that children don't fare well, but maybe we don't agree with Hume either that it's all about desires. This isn't to say that desires are irrelevant. They have some relevance. It's just not, they're just not indicative of the nature of well-being. That's the thought anyway. Okay, so let's turn to Hume's nemesis, some ways. This is the German philosopher, also 18th century philosopher, Immanuel Kant. He didn't say so much about well-being, but he did have quite a lot of views about how to educate and rear children, in particular how to make sure that they understood the nature of the moral demands that are placed on them and their relationship to happiness. So Kant's idea is always that duty is the most important thing, even if it comes at a cost to your happiness. But of course, in order to make this claim clear, he had to say something about it in a sort of strange discussion he has, which takes the form of a dialogue with a young school children, with a young school child. He says the following about well-being. He says, look, well-being consists in enjoyment in life, in the complete satisfaction with one's condition. Sometimes people say, Kant is really just agreeing kind of with Hume about what well-being or evaluative happiness consists in. It's all about the satisfaction of your desires. But since Kant is focusing here on subjective states like enjoyment or satisfaction with one's condition, you might think what he's really doing is saying it's not so much the satisfaction of your desires that makes you better off. It's really the experience of or the possession of certain kinds of things we call enjoyment or satisfaction. So finding your life enjoyable or experiencing enjoyment, finding your life satisfying or experiencing some part of your life as satisfying or fulfilling. That's what really ultimately well-being consists in. And you might think, okay, if we focus on the enjoyment part or the satisfaction part, again, this is a view that is one that can fit lots of different welfare subjects, but also can fit pretty well probably all children, and can do a lot of work explaining what we think is good for them. And here, somewhat shockingly, Hume is joined by some of his also traditional nemesis. This is the 19th century philosopher John Stuart Mill, who wrote lots of things on philosophy and some things in ethics, where he talked a lot about pain and pleasure. He said, by happiness, by which he means evaluative happiness, is intended pleasure and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain and the privation of pleasure. So kind of agreeing with Kant that in some way well-being has as its nature this experiential component, enjoyment, pleasure, pain, and so on. And just one more, this is my favorite philosopher on whom I've written more papers than is probably healthy for people. This is the 19th century philosopher, also Henry Sidgwick, who riffed off of Mill and developed his views in a more comprehensive fashion. And he said, the great attainable surplus of pleasure over pain, that's what we designate as the greatest happiness. So you might think, okay, here's lots of philosophers who are agreeing on the nature of well-being. This view of well-being fits children, so we might say, well, maybe children's happiness consists in, right, pleasure and the absence of pain, or enjoyment and the absence of suffering. Or maybe more broadly, it consists in satisfaction and the absence of dissatisfaction. Whatever the case may be, the thought might be that children's well-being consists in the possession of a certain kind of mental state, right? So that would be pleasure in the case, or enjoyment in the case of well-being, and maybe pain or suffering in the case of ill-being, right? So that view is called, roughly speaking, hedonism. They're all kind of hedonists about well-being or happiness, right? So they agree that's the right view of well-being for everybody, but we might say, look, even if that isn't true, it might be the right view about children's well-being. It does seem like a plausible view when you read a lot of children's stories, as I have in my life. They all talk a lot about happiness, and they all seem to talk about it in terms of experiential feelings, or in having certain kinds of enjoyable or satisfying experiences, right? So it could explain why we emphasize things like play, why we emphasize things like certain kinds of relationships, like healthy relationships with adults, why we think screen time is a bad thing, right? Because it tends to interfere with experiencing good states of mind over the long run, et cetera, et cetera. So we might think, look, maybe it's true that what children's well-being consists in is essentially the having of certain kinds of positive mental states. We'll just call that satisfaction or enjoyment, right? And this, we might say, look, maybe we've got the right view. There's lots of attractions of this view. Maybe people thought this is an attractive view for all kinds of welfare subjects, adults, animals, children. Maybe this is the right view to have. So Again, right, so here's some more pictures of my children. This is them in the bath in Florence in 2011. Right, I took that picture, and it illustrates to me pretty clearly that, look, they're happy, they're experiencing positive states of mind. Look, I would say, look, they're faring well, right? So the hedonistic view, the view that says it's all about positive mental states, it captures and explains why I would say they're faring well. This was some years later. We went to Washington Square in New York City, and I said, well, we got to get the big pretzel and the big apple, and we've got to, get some bling bling. So we got it there, and we got the pretzel. They don't maybe look so much like they're enjoying themselves, but they were enjoying themselves, striking a pose. And the hedonistic view predicts that that thing will be something we will think it makes their lives go well for them. So you might think, look, this is a pretty plausible view. It captures many of our intuitions about what we emphasize in children, like I said, play, friendships, etc. It predicts why this experiences and this experiences are ones we think commonsensically are such that they would contribute to them being better off. Okay. Nonetheless, I'm not persuaded by this view, even though lots of people I like and in the history of philosophy accept this view. And I have two reasons. One is that children have capacities, right? Cognitive capacities, intellectual capacities, cognitive capacities, capacities to do with the will, right? Children also have wills. Maybe they're not so well governed as our will, but they do have wills. And those capacities, you might think, beyond those of being able to, which is also a capacity, experience pleasure and pain, are ones that you might think plausibly have a kind of central role in what makes their life go well for them. So you might think, look, it's true that the capacity to have certain kinds of positive experiences, that's important. That's what the hedonistic view is emphasizing. But it leaves out other kinds of capacities that you might think are important or as important as the kind of capacity to experience positive mental states, and that view leaves out that I think makes it a too narrow view of well-being. So that's sort of an initial thought. Another thought, this is not to me, this is a sort of traditional kind of objection to the hedonistic picture. This objection comes from Robert Nozick. I got this great picture off the internet today. Nozick wrote a book in the 70s called Anarchy, State, and Utopia. His main ambition was to work out the justification for a libertarian political philosophy, but along the way he said lots of really interesting, fantastic, and fruitful things about value and rights and right, wrong, and so on. And he came up with this really great thought experiment, which was supposed to bring out some of those intuitions I spoke about earlier. He said, look, imagine that scientists could build what he called the experience machine, okay? He said this experience machine could give you any experience that you wanted. You choose, right? Positive experience, obviously pleasurable experience, satisfying experience, right? Anyone you want, right? And this experience would be better than any experience you could get in the real world as you actually are, right? So these super duper neuropsychologists, he says, could stimulate your brain so that you would think and feel you were writing a great novel, making a friend, or reading an interesting book. You put your own things in there. But at the same time, all the time you would be floating in a tank, right? Like this person with electrodes attached to your brain, right? You wouldn't know it wasn't real, but you would be fed your experiences. You would think that that's what would happen. You would believe that's what's happening. It would be extremely pleasurable, more pleasurable, as I said, than you could have in your actual life. He says, right, would you plug in? Would you think it would be better for you to plug in if the machine could give you a greater amount of pleasure than you could get as you actually are? So someone comes along to you and says, look, I've got this machine, right? You can plug in. It's going to feel so good. You're going to do whatever you want. It won't be real, but you won't know it. It'll just be like this. For all we know, we could be in a machine right now. Right? He says, look, if you take seriously this hedonistic view and you think it's all about satisfaction, pleasure, enjoyment, whatever, you should think that if this machine gives you the most amount you can get of all the options available to you, this would be best. Now, how many people think this would be best? Okay, so there's a few. Okay, there's always a couple. Get them out of here. No, there's always a couple. That's good. Okay, there's always a couple. So the idea is something like, look, our reaction tells us that, yeah, okay, I think pleasure is good. I value pleasure. Right? I think enjoyment is good. I value that. I enjoy those things. But they aren't the only thing that matter. Right? They aren't the only thing that matter. So our reaction to it tells us something, that our intuition is that things other than pleasure, things other than positive experiences, make a difference to how well your life is going. So you might think the following. Look, suppose I could have all the pleasure I got in the machine and it was real. So instead of inauthentic or virtual relationships, I was having actual ones. Instead of having virtual writings of novels, I was actually writing them. You would think that actual is better in virtue of it being actual. Okay, so that tells you that something other than pleasurable experiences makes a difference to your well-being. So I don't think, for example, right, most of us wouldn't plug in. That tells us something about what we value, what we care about, right? And probably don't think it's good for a child to plug in. We wouldn't think, I've got this machine, right? Come on, kids, it's going to be so good, right? Plug in. I don't think that would be good for them, right? It might give them some things that are good for them, but it might not be the best option for them, right? So that means our thought is that there's more to faring well than pleasure or enjoyment, right? So you might think, look, even if we thought that pleasure and enjoyment mattered to how well a child's life goes, that it captured and explained lots of things that we think are good for them, it wouldn't tell you the whole story. It wouldn't tell you the whole story. Now, of course, there are lots of options here for our friends at the back who said, look, yeah, I would plug in. They could say things like, well, lots of the intuitions we have that suggest that there's more to faring well for a child or for anyone than pleasure. You know, those intuitions, those common sense ideas, there's something wrong with them. We can show that they have a poor source, or we can show that they ultimately really are only about pleasure or pleasure and descriptive happiness, right? Or psychological happiness. We can just debunk those intuitions. So that's one route. That's a common route now. Lots of people take that route who want to defend this view. That's not the route that I want to take. I would like to present a different picture, and maybe only once I've done that, or once people do that, we can make sense of whether we want to dig our feet in and go with our minority in the back and defend hedonism. Okay, so one thing we don't want to do is we don't want to overreact too much to the experience machine objection, right? So as I said a moment ago, it doesn't tell us, or our intuitions about it don't tell us that pleasure isn't something that matters. It just tells us it's not the only thing that matters. It still might be really important. It might play a central role. It's just not the only thing that matters. So my emphasis here is not to overreact. So last week, some of you may have come to my colleague Samantha Brennan's talk. She's also written fantastically about this topic. She developed this view around the same time that I was working on the same topic. She said, look, children's well-being consists in the possession of a kind of list of what we might just call, broadly speaking, goods. And here's her list. One of those lists is unstructured imaginative play. One of those items, relationships with other children and also with adults, right? Maybe we could add animals there. Opportunities to contribute to household and community, right? There's coming back to those chores, right? Time spent outdoors and in the natural world. There's maybe worries that we have about screen time. Physical affection, physical activity and sport, bodily pleasure, music, art, and a few other things. This is a bit misleading to have well-being in there, but anyway, you get the general point. The point is, this is a view that's tailored for children that says children's well-being consists in a certain kind of list. So part of the reason why I'm trying to emphasize not to overreact is not to take from the experience machine the idea that pleasure plays, or satisfaction or positive mental states play a very small role in well-being. Because if you do that, you run into a different kind of problem. So there's something right about this view, don't get me wrong. I think those things are important, they matter, right? But it goes too far in leaving too little room, right? Too little room for that felt satisfaction or the positive experiences that the hedonist was emphasizing. So, right, you might think, look, relationships with other children and adults, if those left a child cold, right? That is, they took no positive mental state in them, or they took no satisfaction in them, or same with play, or contributing to household community, or spending time outdoors. They just, didn't move them, right? You might think it would be very hard to believe that those things contributed a lot to making a child's life go. I'll say something in a minute about this, whether they might contribute something, right? But it would be unclear, it'd be hard to argue in favor of them counting a lot, right? Just because it leaves too little room for this idea, this important notion of felt satisfaction to well-being. And part of the reason I want to emphasize that is just that it seems plausible that how one's experience is, what it feels like, and plays an important role in how well you're faring. But also, it's an important way, I've tried to fill this out in some of the things I've written, I don't think very well. It's part of the way of getting a child's perspective as part of what makes his or her life go well, right? So one of the things that philosophers have emphasized about well-being is that it has an important subjectivity built into it, that it's about how well your life is going from your perspective, at least in part. And so if you have this subjective experience as part of well-being, children's well-being in particular, it makes space for, or gives room for, or makes for an opportunity for their perspective to have a salient or important role in how their life goes, right? Okay. So a better view combines elements of both the hedonistic view, right, that people like Kant and Mill and Sidgwick were defending, and also aspects of the view that Samantha, my colleague, was defending. So she's got part of the story right, of there being a list of goods or important goods, but also the hedonist got something right in emphasizing this felt satisfaction. So the thesis I want to defend is happiness matters, right? How satisfied a child is with her life is important to faring well, but like Samantha and like people who react to the experience machine objection, it isn't the only thing that matters. And so I want to really just state, maybe I could argue at some point, that there's really three kind of central goods, some of which are on Samantha's list, that I think are particularly important things in which it is important for a child to take happiness, and which are part of the nature of a children's well-being. Okay, so here's one of them. This is called play. So Samantha said unstructured play. It's very hard to define what play is, but it's a kind of, absorption in some activity. Like this is me and my children skating on the frigid Sunday of last week at the Covent Garden Market. This is my son trying to photobomb. I can't quite see what he's up to, but couldn't quite get the picture. But the kind of absorption in some activity, right, of some kind, physical activity. There's also other, obviously, mental activities, which has its purpose inside it. It's not done for something beyond it, right? So you're just going out for a skate, or you're playing a board game or something like this. Those are things that have purposes contained in them. Those are the kind of play in which I would argue taking happiness in. They were smiling, if you could see, and that, I think, is an instance in which that's a case of them faring well. Okay, that's one good. Another good is intellectual activity. My children never do their homework, so I don't have any photographs of them doing it, sadly. Okay, so I had to get one off the internet. But another thing is intellectual activity, right? So a lot of philosophers, a lot of people, when I've talked about this issue, always say, look, the important thing for children is to develop, to progress. And I think that's right, and part of the way you can capture that is to say, look, taking happiness in intellectual activity is good for a child because it involves exercising those cognitive capacities I spoke about, but also in a way that is, right, if you look at this, driven by their own, as it were, or at least partly by their own objectives. It's learning, progressing, developing, forms of reasoning, and so on. That's what I sort of mean by intellectual activity. It's taking happiness in that is, again, like taking happiness in play, an instance of something that's good for them, directly, non-instrumentally good for them, right? This is their cognitive ability. I guess, yeah, okay, that's their physical ability. And then finally, valuable relationships. This is another photograph from our vacation to New York City. We went on something called the Intrepid. Afterward, you have to spend a lot of money on these photographs, so we gave the thumbs up. Right, valuable relationships are another thing. When children take happiness in them, as there we are, all gathered together, right? You might think that's something that is good for them. So it's got a social, this view of welfare I'm developing has a social aspect, valuable relationships. It has a cognitive aspect, this is intellectual activity. It has, a physical active component to it, and also involves the element, the positive mental state element that's emphasized by the hedonists. Okay. So the hedonist view was too hot. It ended us up in the machine. It was too narrow, right? Here's my Three Bears and Goldilocks. Is that what it's called? Brennan's list was too cold, right? Because you could have those things in the list, but still be kind of flat or not experiencing any satisfaction. My view is just right? It's happiness in play, intellectual activity. Maybe Goldilocks will think that, and invaluable relationships. So combining elements of both views in a way that kind of emphasizes various aspects of the capacities that children have, but also gets that experiential component on there, gets their point of view, their perspective on there. Okay. So then, to thrive, right, as a child is to take happiness or satisfaction. That's the broad effective attitude in play, intellectual activity, or valuable relationships. This is the highest form of children's well-being. That's why I call it thriving, because it's the top shelf, right? It seems to explain a great many intuitions we have about faring well as a child, while we emphasize play, intellectual development, and progression, while we emphasize the importance of valuable or meaningful relationships, like Samantha did in her list between adults and other children, and why it's important in particular that they take happiness or they find those things satisfying, right? There's a sense in which it engages the aspect of the children's soul, right? The play part, right? The cognitive part, the emotional part, and also the social part, right? Okay. And also it corrects for the errors in the other views, right? So the hedonistic view is too narrow, right? Samantha's view is maybe too broad, right? It can tell you why some desires are ones we think are weird or odd or peculiar, and some desires are good, and so on and so forth. Okay. And then finally, it also, now I want to come back to this because I was telling my children last night, I live in the Wortley Village area, it was garbage night last night. I was trying to tell them, gotta take the garbage out, guys. It's good for you, right? It's good for you. Explains, predicts why it's good for children to do household chores, right? So back to those psychological studies, they say, look, one of the reasons why chores are things that are, things that children should do is that they tend to, when they do it, experience happiness in building certain kind of cooperative relationships of playing a role in the household, right? And it also says that it makes them feel happy in working out what to do and how best to do it. So take the recycling bin out or put the recycling in. I leave them to that. They exercise their ability to try to do it, right? Might say, look, when they're doing it and they're taking a little bit of happiness in it, you might think, right, that's good for them. That's kind of a common sense thought you had, and the view that I'm kind of developing sort of captures and explains that, right? Because it says that well-being consists in having this kind of experience and also in exercising your intellectual capacities. It says that there's satisfaction is important in certain kinds of valuable relationships, right? So if we commonsensically thought, oh yeah, that's good for you to be happy in building cooperative relationships in your home with your parents or your other siblings, whatever, and same for working, doing chores and working out what to do, that would be something that would, on the face of it, seem like it's good for you. My view would predict and kind of explain that that would be a common sense attitude, or that would be an attitude that we would have, or so it seems anyway. Now, of course, I've talked about thriving. I've talked about the sort of top shelf, what we might describe as flourishing as a child, like happiness in those three items, right? But of course, you can sometimes enjoy happiness, right, by itself, right? By itself, right? By itself. Maybe you can have happiness in the absence of intellectual activity, in the absence of valuable relationships, in the absence of something like play. So, enjoying a little bit of ice cream on a hot day, right? Putting your feet in a nice cool pool on a hot day for a child. That's maybe an instance of happiness. I think, look, maybe there's nothing else of the goods or those items that I talked about that are involved. You might think, look, it still counts for something. It's something. but it counts for less, the thought is, than the actual happiness in the one or more of the items. So it counts for something. So I want to say happiness always counts. It's always something good, but it's less good compared to happiness taken in one of the goods. There's some philosophical problems there about how to work that out, but that's the broad idea. So and one thing you want to be careful of is you don't want to argue that you can add all little units of happiness up to make one super happiness that could outweigh any amount of happiness taken in the goods, because of course that's the worry that was raised by the experience machine. Okay. And then finally, you can sometimes play, as I said before, have intellectual activity or valuable relations in the absence of pleasure or in the absence of satisfaction. You might think, many people press me on this, that that's something also like happiness that counts to some degree toward making a child better off, or that contributes directly to her well-being. Okay, so you might think, even if intellectual activity left you cold, maybe if a valuable relationship leaves you cold or unsatisfied, right, it still counts for something. For many of us, myself included, I find that hard to believe. Why? Because it seems like a central necessary condition of faring well is that it somehow engage your perspective, that it somehow contribute in some way toward your experience of your life. Not everybody believes that, so I'm open to the idea that, like happiness, having these goods in the absence of happiness might be something that's good for you, but it will be a lesser good than happiness taken in one of those three things. And part of the reason I'm worried about this, so one of my favorite books when I was an undergraduate was Hard Times by Dickens. This is Mr. Gradgrind, right? He says, teach these boys and girls nothing but facts. Facts alone are wanted in life. Plant nothing else and root out everything else. You can only form the mind of reasoning animals upon facts. Nothing else will ever be of any service to them. The idea being that a child is there to be taught facts. What's good for them is to be a container filled with information from something else, right? Part of the problem with that is it leaves out the active element that a child might contribute to that learning, but also it ignores or doesn't take proper account of their perspective, right? And so part of the reason I'm emphasizing this experiential component is that I want to protect against the idea that a child can fare well simply just by being something that does certain kinds of things, like has valuable relationships or intellectual activity in the absence of happiness. Okay. Right? And so one way you can sort of try to solve this kind of problem, like it's true that these things might be good, might be in some way be important, having facts, being taught, being instructed for children, of course it is, right? They might be important instruments to well-being, I think, because of course information, being able to be controlled and so on, all are good instruments, they're good causes, right? Or you might think, right, that they have some contribution not to faring well or to a child's well-being, but to living a good life for a child. So one of the interesting things is, even if you work out a theory of what's good for or a theory of well-being for children, right, it isn't clear that you've exhausted all of the things that you need to work out a theory of the good life for a child. So you might think well-being is part of what it is to live a good life as a child, right? But it isn't the whole or all of the story. And so working out a view of well-being may be only part of working out a view about what is good for children. So what I tried to do is work out at least, or suggest, or yell, or state some theory of well-being for children. That's a first step, of course, in trying to figure out what that is. And there's other questions about how it relates to adult well-being. And then second of all, it's part of, at least I think, part of working out what is a good life for children. So there may be some things that don't engage their mental states, that don't engage their perspective, that might be things that it would be good for them to have, not from the point of view of their well-being, but from the point of view of living a full or good life. Okay, so that's me. Thank you very much for your attention. That's me drinking some Prosecco, which of course gives me good mental states. Thanks so much for your attention. I appreciate it. I can do it. Yeah. Okay, so now we can turn it over to the question period. Yes.
Thanks for the talk.
Thanks for coming.
I don't think these talks, I think you guys see me around, but it's cool to see it as a non-philosopher in the room. So what the distinction would be between thriving for a kid and thriving for an adult. Why would there make a distinction? And if you make that distinction, at what point do you make that distinction? And if that line isn't clear, you can't say, oh, it's at this age, or you can tell that it's a kid we're talking about, and these are the reasons we're looking for, and how they can thrive versus an adult. You can't. If that's blurry, then why make the distinction? Wouldn't you have a theory that encompasses everyone, including kids, or not kids at all, like Aristotle?
So I guess I want to make room for the idea that they could be distinct, right? That is, that the well-being, the nature of well-being for adults could be distinct from the nature of well-being for children. I want to make room for that possibility, right? So I want to leave it an open question, whether they are the same. Now, of course, it could be the case that the view that I worked out for children could also apply to adults. I guess part of the reason why I'm keen to try to make space for that possibility of those two different conceptions is that I don't want either theory to be beholden, as in a sense, to what it implies for other welfare subjects, right? And also partly, I want it to be the case that the theories of well-being we develop are sensitive to the fact of development, right? Now, of course, you asked a separate question about there's going to be a blurry period there. So there's a good question about what counts as a child. So I didn't say much about that because I don't really know the answer to that, right? So I'm talking about kind of young children. But of course, as children develop, right, and become adolescents, naturally enough, their capacities change. They look more like the capacities that you and I have, right? And there you might think, unlike in the case of children, where their wills are not totally authoritative, our wills are authoritative, and maybe adolescent wills are authoritative. There, I think, that suggests that the theory of well-being we should develop for them should be sensitive to that. So it should make the well-being or the welfare of that subject more dependent on what they care about, their schedule of concerns. Whereas I'm not so convinced that's the case in the case of children, right? So I can put this slightly differently. This maybe is more philosophical than it needs to be. It's sort of like you might think that when it comes to well-being of a subject like you and I, it's really up to us, subject to some exposure to information. It's really up to us what makes our life go well. We decide what our schedule of concerns are. We decide what matters to us. And when we get those things, when we find our lives fulfilling or satisfying, in the context of meeting our goals or expectations, right, that we set for ourselves, that's what's good for us. You might think that's not necessarily a possibility for especially small children, and to the extent that it isn't, we have to find some way to sort of make a difference in the view of well-being that would accommodate that. I don't know if that was quite what was that an answer to your question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
For the most part, it does.
Yeah.
And what I really liked about that is accommodating. You said, okay, well, we can add some contingencies. Great.
Yeah.
That accommodates every age, and
Yeah.
you don't really have to be too worried about the distinction between too young and what age they're at. But then I would extend that farther and say, well, if it's contingent that you really want to be sensitive to every age, why don't you extend that farther? Because you might be a theory for how you might thrive might differ when you're 85.
Yeah, well, that's right. So you could have this is less plausible, but you could have a theory of well-being for senescence, right? Which is old age. You could that's a possibility. That seems less likely because the developmental differences in adults is quite small, right, relative to children. But I take the point that it seems strange to say all the things I said and just say, oh, well, it applies only to children, when clearly it could apply to adults. I think the thought was, I want to make space for the possibility that they're different. So maybe here's a way into that. So I doubt anybody would be fussed if I said, look, how your cat fares, right, is really different in its nature from how you fare, right? Or how you faring well is quite different from how your cat faring well is. No one would be fussed about that, right? Probably. Right? You wouldn't think there'd be radical discontinuities between that, right? In terms of the nature, right? In terms of the nature. I mean, look, hedonists aren't going to believe this, but you might think, look, that's plausible. So, but why not have it within the context or in the category of adults? Or humans. Sorry. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. We get some. Yeah.
I just one person you left out maybe there was Freud. I think you're born with an amygdala. You've got an id. You want food. You don't want to be hurt.
Right.
And you don't care about anybody else.
Right.
And
That's a dark view of humanity, but yes.
Unless you're Mr. Hyde.
Okay.
What happens is your mother, and then your school, and then society gradually imposes
uniformity upon you, conformity, yeah. So what's the implication for?
I'm just saying that as you grow, you sort of temper your desires a little bit. You realize that you have to have them in tune with society as a whole. That's good for you and good for everybody else.
Right.
But the main reason is because it'll be good for you. And you keep tempering your desires so you can. So
the tempering of desires is supposed to be good for you? Is that the idea? Yeah, I see. Right. So right. Because of course there can be all kinds of cases in which what you want conflict with what you have an obligation to do. Right. That's an enduring, perpetual conflict we all have between what we would like to do, what would make us happy, and what we are obliged to do or what we ought to do. Right. But probably it's going to be true that there's. This would be a hope that we would build a world in which, what we would want and what we have to do will be largely coincident, right? So that there wouldn't be that tension. But there would always be, I think, room for the idea that, what would control your desires might not always be controlling them in a way that would conduce to your well-being. They might control it in a way that doesn't. Lots of people who talk about desire views, right? Talk about this idea of adaptation or socialization, right? We all have desires partly not because they're authentically what we want, but they're what society tells us, right? I mean, it's unclear whether that's a going concern in the case of children, right? But certainly that's a general worry that we might have about desire positions. But there would always be a kind of tension there.
I also just want to observe that Hume is sort of frustratingly hard to argue with. He always is, because he's less interesting than other people who try to make something out of nothing. But they're more interesting. But it's a question of whether they succeed or not is always there. And so in this case, these hedonists, they tried to get beyond satisfaction of your desires, but I don't know that these actually succeeded.
Okay, good. Yeah.
I would say, would you say that a child would have more of the id just to follow than anything else? And you'd have to accept that. Accept that the child is very self-centered, extremely, and doesn't know the environment or the effect that he's having. Some people are dealing with nightmarish children that they say, oh, this kid is a nightmare, or we had a breakdown or something today. Well, it's probably because he didn't get what he wanted. Because you obviously end up giving them what they want, otherwise it's hell.
Right. So I'm not a psychologist, so I probably can't comment on that. But yeah, I mean, I think again, one of the reasons why we might be reluctant to endorse a view according to which what's good for them is that they get what they want is not only that it has kind of long-term, disbenefits to them, because of course delayed gratification is an important virtue, as we might think, to develop from the point of view of your own well-being, right? But also just because lots of their desires are very queer or wonky, right? And it isn't just because they're in conflict with other things they desire. You just think that's just not something, the having of which is good for you, right? Yeah. Does that make sense?
Unfortunately, the adult doesn't sometimes perceive what the child really is interested in.
Well, we all give in to expediency some of the time, right? Right. We're weak, right? Okay. Just behind there, did you have a question? Yeah.
When you were talking about the three elements, the play, intellectual activity, relationships.
Valuable relationships,
very intentional about your use of the word or.
Right.
And I also noticed that one or more.
Right. Well, all of them will be great.
Well,
yeah.
This is what I'm
That's kind of hard, though.
So is it your view that thriving can exist with only one of those?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess the answer is no. And so then that gets into complicated issues about distribution, right? So maybe your question is something like, well, look, suppose there was a child who was taking lots of happiness or satisfaction in just one of the items. And maybe they couldn't get the other items, or they didn't turn them on, or whatever, right? You might think, well, look, would that be sufficient for thriving? That's kind of the way to view your question. Okay, so I think, so it's hard to know exactly what to think about this, but one thought is just, no, they should have some amount of all of them, right? So that if they do engage certain kind of capacities, right, having them would make for a more complete well-being. That's an issue about how to distribute these things. So you might think that there should be some kind of roughly equal distribution of happiness in all of those items. That's, of course, a difficult, messy question about then, well, so how do you work this out? Just not even practically, but philosophically, what's the right amount? So you might think, look, suppose they could have lots of one, only little bits of others, but to get a little bit more of these, you'd have to lower this. That's a very complicated issue. But I guess the general thought is, right, so if you look at the question about what makes a life go well, it would be, right, having some kind of happiness or satisfaction in all three of those goods to some measure. I hate to make that claim, but that's the nature of what we're doing here. I mean, I'd have to go a bit further, but that's a really fantastic question. Yeah. Yeah, in the back.
I wonder if you, in light of what you said, I wonder if you have any thoughts on how particularly primary education ought to be structured.
So I'm not an educator. I mean, at the primary school level, I'm not a person who knows a lot about that issue. I mean, presumably at some point the view would, that I developed would entail something about that. What it would, I'm not exactly sure, but it would be useful to talk to people who work in education or who research education. To what extent the view would be helpful, to what extent it would explain or not explain certain thoughts about how to structure things, like, should we have more recess, should we have more standardized testing, should we have less of those things, etc. I don't really have well-developed views about that, but I'm sure, somebody who works in that territory could probably help us put some things together and maybe make some claims about what it would imply. I'm not sure yet. Sorry. I hate to venture outside of my tiny expertise. We're being filmed, so I can't, I have to stay.
I've got a grandson who comes home with homework in kindergarten, and I've got others who are in the play approach in grade 2.
Right. Well, so I mean, my own experience with my own children is these things are very cyclical. Yeah. Right. Partly they're driven by the fact that they have at certain points standardized testing, so there's more homework. In cases where they don't, there's less homework. Yeah, I mean, homework, of course, is a whole other kettle of worms. It's very hard for people to get their children to do it. But yeah, I'm not sure what the right view is on that. I mean, we also have to think about, what things to train children in obtaining, or how to equip children, because many of them will be adults, right? And they need certain kinds of skills. And that sometimes those skills might be in opposition to what's good for them in the moment. You have a question?
I do.
I thought you were telling me to stop. Yeah.
I have a question. I usually don't ask questions because this is my job.
But you're so stimulated.
But I can't resist.
Okay.
So I feel I've heard a lot today about external factors, things that adults might do to help child thrive, things the child might want and get that might satisfy them or not, and so on. Have you considered intrinsic, internal things? Are some children predisposed to be more happy? Either they're physically well, they have a constitution, they seem to be content, more content than another child, and this contentment flows through their life, and they're happy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, again, I'm not.
Whether it's a genetic thing, or
well, there is kind of a biological set point for happiness levels. That's right. Some people are just more likely to be happy because of their genetic makeup than other people. yeah, I mean, so some people who studied things like life satisfaction, they've discovered that, for example, people have a kind of, as they call it, sort of biological set point for their levels of happiness. People can correct me if I'm wrong. That even when they have certain kinds of events in their life that sort of either cause them to have a spike in their happiness level or in their unhappiness level, they tend after time to kind of return to that set point. And presumably, I have no idea about this because I haven't inquired into it scientifically, but I'm sure that people's biological set points are at different levels, right? I mean, we all know people who are just more disposed to be cheery and upbeat, and people who are more morose, right? And what's the opposite of upbeat? Downbeat, I guess. I don't know.
So in studying this, is the object really as adults with children in our lives to be able to help them, to understand what helps them to thrive, so we can provide for them, and then taking the context of this child's easy to provide for, and this one's
right. So presumably they're going to be more in difficult cases. So sometimes it's going to be easy to make an individual fare well because of facts about their genes, but also facts about their social circumstances, and there are going to be other cases where it's harder, right?
And there could be benefits to being miserable, I suppose.
Pardon me?
There might be benefits to being not happy.
Well, certainly there are going to be cases in which being unhappy about something is actually a rational response, right? Because typically if you're unhappy, you're apt to change. So I mean, happiness and unhappiness are, unhappiness can be, like experiencing pain can be a legitimate, helpful response to something. Like if you didn't feel pain, you'd be dead pretty soon, right? You need that as an ability to change your circumstances, right? So yeah, I mean, and of course, it's going to be the case that people should experience some disappointment, right? Because life is full of those things, and you have to equip yourself with the skills for dealing with that. So like I said, at the end about, working out a view of the good life for a child may involve saying things about exactly what you're talking about. So equipping people with the ability to have a perseverance in the face of adversity, right? That's a kind of virtue, kind of perseverance. It's important that people develop. So maybe there's some room for saying, look, we should set people up to experience, or set children up to experience these failures, because that will help equip them with a virtue or a skill, right, that is useful for them in their lives as a whole, but also might be part of, developing virtues. And virtue might be part of a good life for a child, even if it comes at an expense of well-being or faring well. Yeah, I think that's an open possibility for sure.
So as parents, instead of trying to make the road smooth for children,
yeah,
we try to build them so they're strong and persevere.
Right. So that's right. So it may be the case that if your children are going to turn into adults, that in order to fare well as an adult, you need to have certain kinds of skills, right? Certain kinds of, broadly speaking, virtues. And you might think, that it would be good to equip your children with those kinds of things, right? That would be part of what it would lead to live a good life for a child, right? Even if it comes at some cost to them in the short term. Yeah, that's certainly. I mean, certainly we're going to be, we're always balancing what's good for an individual now versus what's good for an individual in the future. I mean, we're all doing that. We're all doing that kind of, roughly speaking, prudential calculation, right? Should we delay gratification now for a greater payoff in the future, etc. Yeah. Okay, so yeah. Good too, yeah.
Does this theory cater for the differences in the backgrounds of children? For example, we are living in a society that has a lot of immigrants, diversity in cultural backgrounds, and with that comes a lot of differences in the parent. Parenting styles.
Differences in what was the last? Differences in
cultural backgrounds.
Yeah.
As well. So, how does that work in the scheme of things in terms of defining that, and also how does it work if it clashes with that?
Right. So That's a good question. So that's kind of like a more theoretical, philosophical question. So, sorry? Yeah. So yeah, that's right. You would think anyway. So it's one of those things where people say, well, look, we have these sort of normative views. Like, so I'm giving a view about what children's well-being consists in. But we have other normative views about what's the best way to treat children. We have different views about what constitutes valuable relationships, different views about what constitutes play, etc. So one way to sort of summarize what that set of thoughts is expressing is there's a disagreement, right? And so how do you persist in the face of disagreement, particularly about these value issues? You use the idea of cultural backgrounds, but there could be any source, right, for disagreement. So the question is, how do you do that? Well, so I guess part of what I'm more inclined toward is just say, look, there's probably a truth of the matter about what it is, right? And so the way we get to it is we do this. We have arguments. We have a discussion. We have debates. I'm pretty sure that lots of things that people say about well-being kind of are kind of kind of not clearly culturally bound. They're not clearly what we might call parochial attitudes, right? And so to that extent, I think, maybe we can persist in the face of disagreement, or you can just say, well, look, no, these are facts, and if there's cultural conflict, then there's a mistake being made somewhere. But it's true. So I think it's always important, always. It's always important that it's always always important to be sensitive to how culturally bound your views are. Like you might go somewhere in the Middle East, or you might go to India, or you might go to a country in Africa, you might go to Japan, and be like, you might think, look, this is completely foreign to us, right? So there, I think probably we're going to find more agreement than might appear to be the case, but yeah, certainly that's a possibility that this could be culturally, specific. I hope that's not the case, but yeah, it's certainly a possibility. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question, but it's a question really about the worry is, look, if there's a lot of disagreement, we might think this is just kind of like fine for a kind of Canadian or North American or other kind of audience, but it's not going to have much resonance beyond that. Yeah, I hope that's not the case, but that's an option. Yeah.
Could you just clarify for me, would make me happy in this moment.
Great.
The part on the slide where you mentioned that children's desires, the pool of desires is shallow, not very deep.
Yeah.
Could you just clarify for me if that is your opinion or if that is just of the philosophy that you were mentioning?
Right. So that's my opinion, I guess. I don't like to use the word opinion, but that's my view. So I guess what I was, I didn't really say this well when I was talking about it, but sort of one of the thoughts people have when they talk about desires, right? The satisfaction of desires being good for us, is as I said before, the worry that some of our desires are not really our own, right? They're a product of socialization or the product of adaptation or something like this, or some desires are strange or bizarre or whatever. And so people who want to defend this desire satisfaction view, not necessarily about children but about anyone, try to say, well, look, it isn't just the desires you actually have, it's some set of desires you would have once you kind of reflected, once you kind of had a little bit more information, maybe had a little bit more exposure to kind of logic. That's a sort of way of saying, once we laundered your desires, then we would get an account of what are truly your desires. And once you do that, you're going to get rid of some of the initial desires you had, right? So I guess my thought was, it might be plausible to take that strategy in the case we're talking about someone like you, right, or me, who has a pretty broad, extensive network of desires. Exposing them to information or to facts might, in the end, get you a pretty good set of desires that we would think intuitively would capture all of what matters to your well-being. The reason I said that doesn't, or what I wanted to say was it doesn't really work in the case of children because it's not clear how broad their set of desires is, such that even if you could subject them to this laundering process, that you would get a set of desires that would capture all of what matters to them. Does that answer the question? That was the thought. I don't know if it's right or not, but I've written it already, so it must be right. But that was the thought I was expressing.
Okay.
Yeah. And then you might think, look, to the extent to which you really, truly wanted to launder them, you would just be depending on some of those items I listed to do the laundering, in which case you've kind of got the view that I'm gesturing at. But that's a good question. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Is that it? Great. Thanks so much for your great questions and for your attendance and your attention.